Welcome to the Black Creator Series, brought to you by Candlewick Press in collaboration with Red Clay Educators. Hosted by Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, bringing dynamic books, authors, illustrators, and artists to your classroom and to the world. Look for episodes of the Black Creator Series on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Here's Candlewick's Kathleen Rourke to introduce this week's guest.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Kathleen Rourke from Candlewick Press, and we have two fabulous authors this episode, Frederick and Porsche Joseph. Frederick is the author of two instant New York Times bestsellers, The Black Friend on Being a Better White Person and Patriarchy Blues, Reflections on Manhood. He is also the author of the picture book Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, The Courage to Dream. Porsche is a development professional, writer, former educator, and seasoned activist who has worked tirelessly in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. Their book, Better Than We Found It, Conversations to Help Save the World, featuring more than 24 interviews with prominent activists, authors, actors, and politicians, is the essential resource for those who want to make the world better than we found it. I now turn the conversation over to Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, a New York Times bestselling author, educator, founder of Red Clay Educators, and co-founder of the Institute for Racial Equity in Literacy.
Porsche, Fred, thank you for joining the Black Creator Series.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Excited to be here.
Me too. So both of you are activists and you have been for quite some time. What are some of the causes and projects and movements that are part of your activism?
Yeah, I think definitely a focus on young people is a part of our activism. I think that we're seeing a really different type of young folks today. They have a lot of knowledge at their fingertips. We talk about it all the time, how different it is having social media and just different forms of communication. But what does that really look like for being able to encourage and reach an audience that's much younger? So that's a big piece of our activism, which is really a large part of what led us to write this book.
Yeah, I think that our activism kind of falls at the intersection of everything in a way, right? Because all these issues that our society is facing, whether they are white supremacy, patriarchy, climate disasters, they all are intersectional, right? Like you can't talk about climate disasters without talking about environmental racism and then ultimately talking about white supremacy, right? You can't talk about patriarchy without talking about anti-Blackness and specifically anti-Blackness, misogynoir against Black women and then specifically against Black trans women. Thus you talk about transphobia. So, I think we try our best to see the landscape and intersectionally tackle everything that we can whenever we can.
Yeah. And Porsche, it's interesting. You mentioned social media, it is a powerful platform for activism. It is also a convenient platform for performative activism. So how do we help young people understand the difference between jumping on a trend simply to increase your social capital versus real activism? And to those who might say, what's the big deal? It's bringing attention to the cause and that's what matters. How do we help them see how slacktivism, right, can be problematic?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll let Fred start off with that because honestly, he's really engaged on social media in a way that I'm not, but it is interesting to see, particularly over the past few years, how that has come to fruition because a lot of people were very activated, as we saw, but how do we actually get that to turn into movement building? And so Fred thinks about this a lot, so I'm going to pass that on to him.
Yeah, I think funny enough, we actually discussed this in the chapter that the brilliant Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul is featured in, around anti-racism. And I think the chapter focuses on like how Black squares, as an example, are not activism, right? And I think that to discern between slacktivism, as you said, and actual activism, you have to ask yourself, what does something accomplish, right? I always ask myself, I ask young people, I ask everyone around me, what are your actions accomplishing, right? Like a Black square, what is the end game of a black square? Because let's say in the instance of the murder of George Floyd or the murder of Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery, your black square is not necessarily bringing awareness, as this is the topic that everyone is talking about around the world right now. So what we actually need is actionable change. And how does a black square bring actionable change, right? Oftentimes social media allows people to, as you said, be performative. Thus, the only change is being brought to their social capital, right? But when you step away from how many followers you have or how many retweets you're getting and things like that, you have to ask yourself, how does this move the needle? And if you can't answer that, then it probably isn't activism.
I love that. How does this move the needle? How is this going to result in sustained attention and action around an issue, right? Because the token support or slacktivism or performative activism, it's dangerous, because when the issue is no longer part of that news cycle, right, the attention also wanes. And issues that you cover in Better Than We Found It, which we're going to get into soon, issues such as racism and homophobia and anti-Semitism and poverty and sexual abuse, they deserve our full, sustained attention. I'm wondering if you both could go back a bit to being young people yourselves in elementary and middle school and even high school. What curriculum and teaching and texts helped to inform your understanding of what activism is and what it means to be global citizens?
Yeah, I think that even touching on what you were both talking about a moment ago, it was a little different when we were younger because I didn't have social media in the same way. I won't date myself, but we did not have social media in the same way. And so a lot of that idea of activism wasn't even available at our fingertips of thinking that we were going to post something. So a lot of it was very much restricted to our interpersonal lives, right? And so I know since I was young, some things that really influenced me was reading and just the concept of being able to lift and find the importance in voices that were not necessarily always represented in my curriculum. And so when I was young, I was constantly challenging people. That was something, I think that looking back, that's that's sometimes could be the greatest form of activism, is maybe just challenging those around you. So even for curriculum, I recall having certain books that that I was assigned to read, and I would say, no, can I suggest reading something else? Can I suggest this Black woman as a voice that I would like to hear from, instead of this other author who does not check those boxes of having diverse voices in our classroom? And so I did that. I remember pushing back on that and creating my own reading curriculum. I didn't just, I opposed the teacher's curriculum, but I created my own and made a case for it. And I think that in being able to do something like that really sets a path forward for teachers to maybe even open up their mind and consider what are we teaching? What do students want to hear? And how are we listening to our students? So a lot of that global citizen concept was built around reading, around exploring different worlds through hearing different people's voices. I think my favorite author is Zora Neale Hurston, and I decided that when I was in 11th grade. And so, as a Black woman from Florida, that's not my experience. And to hear her voice come through on those pages so alive, it just very much impacted me. And so, a lot of that was from reading and hearing other people's voices and really making that a center of my learning independently, not just through school curriculum.
Yeah, I think for me, I didn't have the wherewithal to create my own curriculum as Porsche did, but I think our experiences are a little different in that I didn't even, and I've been very open about this, I didn't realize how stifled I was and suppressed in my Blackness academically, socially, until I got to college. Right. So prior to that, I was in many ways an accessory to the whiteness that I was around, and then when I got to college, I remember my first time, I specifically remember doing a Black Solidarity Day on campus. I didn't know what that was, but it was this day for Black people to come together, and people were sharing experiences and thoughts. And we brought in, or the group that led it brought in Amiri Baraka. And so I met Amiri Baraka, and I was just asking all these questions, right? And for those who are not familiar with Amiri Baraka, brilliant writer, brilliant poet, brilliant radical thinker as it pertains to Blackness. But Amiri Baraka has said to me, he's like, you have a lot of questions. You need to keep on asking, and you need to also start pushing back on why some of these questions haven't already been answered. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, okay, so I started reading more, right? And I remember picking up my first James Baldwin book and wondering why I hadn't been given these things in high school, right? I've said this very pointedly before. I left high school thinking that the greatest author of all time was F. Scott Fitzgerald, not because I loved F. Scott Fitzgerald, but because that's what whiteness had taught me, right? I had never been introduced to Toni Morrison. I had never been introduced to Zora Neale Hurston, and so on and so forth. And so when that opened my mind to the possibilities, not just for Blackness, but for anything that wasn't, cishet, white Judeo-Christian, right? And what that meant for if I was so stifled in not understanding my place in it all, how else are we stifled, right? What am I missing from the entire diaspora, right? So that kind of like opened my world to seeing myself, or beginning to consider myself as a global citizen and wanting to be a global change maker, really.
And I think so many young people have similar experiences where they don't have the kind of access that you're talking about, right? Porsche had the gumption to design her own reading sort of curriculum, right? I'm going to make my own sort of pathway here. And I think there are, many kids doing that as well. But imagine if they had this kind of access at their fingertips, which is what Better Than We Found It does. And instead of having to wait until we are in college or beyond to know a Zora Neale Hurston, to know about Amiri Baraka and so many other people that young people should have access to and ideas. We know that we are in a particularly challenging moment in education to teach in ways that provide students with full access to the truth about the United States, about the experiences of those who have been oppressed and marginalized and continue to be. But before, and we can anticipate beyond this moment, right? So even before this moment and beyond this moment, some educators avoid talking and teaching about topics such as racism, climate change, contemporary immigration issues. They say it's too political for the classroom. What kind of conversations do you think are needed in the field of education with educators to challenge that stance?
I think that there's a lot of disconnect between really understanding regionally and systemically what people have agreed upon as the purpose of education. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a lot of fear right now around some of the things that are, conversations amongst young people and amongst society in general, because, a lot of times educators, they may not be educated in those subjects. And unless they want to seek to be educated in those subjects or have a broader range of understanding, then, it kind of can create this barrier. Because how could they ever champion their kids that they're supposed to be educating, learning things that they can't they have not put in effort to grasp themselves. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to things being political, a lot of things are, in fact, quite not very political at all, and but a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around unless you are trying to. And so I think that's, I mean, first defining what is political. A lot of these things are just very much not political. I mean, the very essence of politics in itself is voting on things that affect society. So when did they become political? You know, these things are political because they affect you and I, but they are not in themselves, you know, restrained to being just political in one way, shape, or, you know, form. But I do think that if we could understand and dig into why things are becoming political, like, for instance, if gun violence is political, yes, it is on the ballot for a reason, because it's affecting you and I. It is, you know, has been made its way into politics, but very much because it is affecting all of us firsthand. And so I think identifying what that even means for something to be political and agreeing that that's not that is not like a safe all, like a word that we can just throw out there when we don't want to tackle something or we don't want to address something. That's not just a word that we can just label things with and say that it's political, and so we don't bring politics into the classroom. That is outdated and doesn't serve anybody, because it's just not even interrogated enough to really say that we can even make statements like that. So
I also think it's an attempt to position teaching as neutral.
Right.
And as an educator, I want to speak very clearly to all educators. Teaching is political, right? To teach about racism, to teach about climate change, to teach about immigration. Yeah, it's political. And to not teach about racism and climate change and immigration, that too is political, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, we need to embrace this. We need to, just sort of understand and acknowledge that teaching is inherently political, and that educators make numerous political decisions every day in their classroom. So I guess I'm kind of arguing it from the other stance that, yeah, it's political, from what book you're teaching to which books you're not, to which holidays you're talking about, to which you don't. Because it is being used as a way to say, no, my job is to be neutral, and there is no such thing.
Right, and I think that ultimately neutrality has always been impossible in teaching also, right? You know, you not wanting to unpack your own anti-racism, your own racism rather, your own patriarchy, your own various forms of internalized oppression only allows you to actually teach certain kids, right? Yeah. Like I've said very, very often, I never felt like my white educators actually could teach me or were invested in teaching me, right? Because they had internalized and been indoctrinated in so much hatred for me, whether consciously or subconsciously, and thus they weren't neutral. They were primarily teaching my white counterparts in the class, right? Also, you know, to the point that Porsche made about the what teaching is supposed to be, or what the role of a teacher is, you know, to teach something is to facilitate growth. To facilitate growth is to open the door to progress. If we are not progressing, you are actually not doing your job. Right. So if as a society, we are staying stagnant, if as a society, we are regressing, if in your classroom, you are not opening that door to change, then you need to take a look at the fact that you are actually not doing your job well.
Let's talk about the book that is urgently needed in every classroom. And that is Better Than We Found It: Conversations to Help Save the World. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how did this incredible, comprehensive collection of conversations come about? And what was it like to write this as partners professionally and personally?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. So, you know, Better Than We Found It is very much a follow-up to my debut book, The Black Friend. And we saw that book performed very well, and it seemingly created some change for many people. It allowed them to interrogate things about themselves. So we wanted to use a similar format with this book. You know, Porsche and I telling stories that relate to the various chapter topics, and then, you know, speaking to thought leaders, politicians, activists, you know, just phenomenal change makers about said topics. So Portia will be able to say how it was working together on this. I think it was a fun and important book to write, but the most difficult book that I've ever worked on of all my books, because we were attempting to do something that hasn't been done.
Yeah, and I will say that for those people who read The Black Friend, where, Fred really digs into his personal experiences, because we covered such a wide range of different subject matter here that we're not experts in. So that's why we brought in the interviewers for all of these subjects, but we wrote our personal stories, but we also brought in a lot more data and a lot more, I guess, how would you describe that, Fred? Like, they're just a little meatier. The chapters, they're a little bit longer. The book is very large. So, but it's really digestible because each chapter kind of stands alone. And then we do have really great interviews with people who are experts in the field and really shed light on some of our personal anecdotes. So I would say that working with Fred was fun. I don't know. I could say that I learned a lot from him because this was not his first go around, but it was my first book. And so just going through the process together, it was really nice having somebody to, be working alongside, especially since it was my first time writing a book. So.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, you both gathered an incredible group of people to be in conversation with you in this book. Why was it important to you to invite this variety of voices and to take an intersectional stance as writers of this book, which I don't think is something we see a lot of in many books?
Yeah, I think to the point that Portia made, while we're not experts in every topic in the book, we do have experiences in every topic in the book, right? And so having an experience with transphobia, neither of us exists as a trans person, but we have seen and been in proximity to the scourge of transphobia. Thus, we can high level talk about it, but it's important to actually get someone who's an expert in that space, right? The same thing with homophobia. And so we went out and we sought people who were going to come from an intersectional disposition, not just in their own topic matter, but people who can relate to the other chapters, right? So it's like important that if you're going to get somebody such as yourself to talk about racism, you're also someone who is going to tie that back to the military industrial complex, tie that back to, the prison industrial complex, so on and so forth, so that young people and just people in general, I think that this book is not just for young people. I think this book needs to be read by all ages. People could see how all these things relate, right? Like none of these chapters exist in a silo whatsoever. And it was important to get people who understand that the chapters don't exist in a silo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So important. And, as we've been saying, Better Than We Found It covers so many of the urgent, serious topics and issues that are plaguing the world. And as I was reading the book and marveling at the work that you've done, I was thinking about toxic positivity. And that can be one way that educators and caregivers approach these issues because they believe that young people can't handle the truth and they will feel too sad, etc. And so I'm wondering, how did you both find the balance between being the truth tellers you are about these critical issues and providing a pathway for young people to be hopeful about the possibilities of change?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the bottom line was to try to, circling back to the conversation at the beginning of this conversation, the bottom line was to try to motivate people to change things and to really look at things differently, but take action. So a lot of these subjects are heavy and it's not happy. There's issues, and that's what the whole book is really about, is these issues and how to solve them. And so I think the hope lies in how to solve them. The fact that there are, people thinking about solutions, and we can be one of the people thinking about solutions and taking action towards that. So, I mean, yeah, Fred.
Yeah, I think that toxic positivity is actually one of the most dangerous things in society right now, right? You know, if we're having a real conversation, you even look at the bestseller lists, there hasn't been a nonfiction young adult or youth literature book on many of the bestseller lists for months, right? Because people equate horrible moments in society with the necessity of learning. But in learning, you have to make a space for learning in your heart and do it consistently on a regular basis, right? Whether that's in your home or in your classroom. But people, again, after 2020 and the elections and things of that sort, they deemed that there was no longer a need to learn in many instances, and thus they leaned into that toxic positivity of, oh well, why can't we just be happy? Ultimately we can be happy. We have to understand that both things have to exist parallel to one another. You have to be able to enjoy your life while also speaking truth to power at the exact same time, right? And if we don't speak truth to power, the spaces that are created for that joy and that happiness that you want will be lessened and ultimately dismantled and destroyed eventually.
Absolutely. And I think especially people, if you're thinking from spaces of privilege that they have, like, we get it, it's tiring. It's like being thoughtful about things, and other people who, have different identities than you. It's tiring. It's work. It's hard work, but the toxic positivity of saying like, well, let's find space for the joy and the happiness. There's space for joy and happiness, but not at, the expense of doing the work. And it's a long road ahead. And so, it's going to be tiring having these conversations, confronting your family members, being the person that's maybe, having the conversations that aren't fun. But that is the work. And so I think there's joy in the work. And I think that there's joy when you can realize, the effect that you're having, or the person that you're growing into that you might want to be. So,
and I so appreciate better than we found it, because it not only does it help to inform, but it gives us the tools. It gives educators the tools to facilitate these conversations so that we can have these discussions with kids, so that kids can acquire tools to dismantle some of this. That's the hope, right, in this work. And so having this book can really help us as teachers have these conversations with young people that we might otherwise find tricky. And I agree with you that this is a book for everyone, not just students. And I also want to take a moment to shout out the toolkit, the digital toolkit you all created. And perhaps you can talk us through this, because I think it's incredible for educators to know about, so that when they are using this book and reading this book, they are able to go here to this website that you've created. And could you talk to us a little bit about what they will have access to, and what young people will have access to when they go here?
So we saw the book almost as somewhat like a constitution of change, right? Living, breathing document. And to create a living, breathing document, truly, you can use the internet, right? And always update, add things, change things as necessary. So we said, let's take some of the book out of the book and bring it online, like meet people where they are, right? Like, in the Black Friend, I had like a section on like what to read, what to watch. And we said, we should do that, but it's not just about reading and watching. It's like, what can you actually do? Porsche, and one of our colleagues, brilliant designer and just partner in all things progress, Jackie D'Amato, collaborated with us on creating this phenomenal website.
Yeah.
So to your point, Sonja, like one of our goals was also to give people more things to read and more things to watch, but then also just actionable things, organizations that are doing work to put on your radar that you can volunteer with, a list of things that you can do, so for each chapter, each subject, we really tried to just dig a little bit deeper in case those dots weren't automatically connected for the readers.
Yeah, this is just incredible, comprehensive work, all done for us as educators. It's right here to just really help students who, it's been my experience that students are change makers. They are truth seekers. And so you've just given so many wonderful tools and opportunities for kids to show up in the authentic ways that I do believe they want to show up, in the ways they want to show up. And the title pretty much makes it clear what your intentions are for this book. But what are your hopes for how educators might use this book in the classroom, and what young people will do when they access the ideas in this book?
My hope is really that people can can relate to this book, because although the subjects are, like we mentioned, can be a bit heavy, and it's a great learning tool, but also we shared stories about ourselves. So we shared stories about from when we were young, and so I hope that those stories are able to relate to people who are reading it, and with that be able to maybe see themselves in each of these, because like Fred said, while we may not have firsthand experience or be the expert in something like transphobia, we have experiences that that moved us to feel very passionate about activism around transphobia. And so something like that, maybe Fred sharing a story that someone else can relate to, and really make them understand or see it from a different perspective. That's my hope.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Porsche said, obviously, I think that my hope for the book is that it'll make people courageous, right? That it will give people, especially through our, like Porsche said, through our stories, right? I think vulnerability is so often a tool used by the greatest of writers, the greatest of thinkers, as an olive branch to get people to want to have the courage to change, right? And in this book, we did that, right? When Porsche is telling these deeply personal stories of how the prison industrial complex has impacted her and her family, right? That's not for nothing, right? That is so she can call out, call out how she's interrogated her own existence within these systems, so that you might do the same. And then when you do the same, how are we tearing these things down together? Right. And I think that this entire book, the vulnerability put in it, the honesty put in it, is just us saying, like, we're right here on the front lines with you. Can we all have the courage to do this together?
I want, educators to know that the teaching of social studies and history requires educators to draw upon various disciplines: anthropology, economics, geography, history, law, sociology, mathematics, the natural sciences, and more. And a major goal of the National Council for Social Studies standards is that students develop civic competence. So we began this conversation talking about what does it mean to be a global citizen. And the standards ask teachers to work in ways that help students develop the ability to make informed and reasoned decisions for the public good as citizens of a culturally diverse, democratic society. And Better Than We Found It is perfectly aligned to the standards of social studies, humanities, and ELA classrooms. So I want educators to know that. And one of my hopes as I read your work and admire your work is this: I see accountability as a through line between everything that you're talking about. And my hope is that young people will learn about what it means to be accountable, right? What does that really mean? Beyond our Black squares, beyond our Black Lives Matter flags, what does it mean to be accountable as a human being on this planet? What's now and next for you? Fred, you are a New York Times, a #1 New York Times bestselling author. You've written The Black Friend, Patriarchy Blues, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, The Courage to Dream. Anti-racism and liberation are strong themes across all of your work. And Porsche, Better Than We Found It is your debut work. And what a stunningly brilliant start this is. What's next for both of you? And might you co-write again?
Portia, why don't you say what's next for you and what you're
I would love an opportunity to co-write again. But I do want to focus on writing some children's book, a little bit younger age, and focus on doing some more art. I really love to paint and illustrate. And so that's where my thoughts and my heart is at right now.
Yeah.
She's a phenomenal painter and illustrator. So I'm hoping that she does lean into that. As far as me, so I'm actually taking a step back from young nonfiction for a while. I think that in a world where patriarchy blues and the Black friend and Better Than We Found It exist, I'm stepping actually into fiction. So I recently agreed to a deal for my debut novel, which is actually also with Candlewick Press, as well as a follow-up picture book, or books rather, to my Wakanda Forever picture book. And I'm also navigating a potential nonfiction adult book that is a reckoning with joy and pain, and how we navigate those waters. So a lot going on.
A lot of projects.
Yeah, I guess so, right? But the main thing, as soon as we're off this call, I'll be back in my document, finishing up some touches on the novel, so everyone can look for that, I believe, in 2025.
Okay, that's exciting. And so much for us to look forward to. Well, Porsche and Fred, your writing invites young people to think about their identities, to confront the truth about this country and the world, and to consider how our positionality and privilege impacts how we can leave the world better than we found it. As a result, you've challenged and changed all of us. What does it mean to you to be a Black creator?
For me, being a Black creator means legacy, right? It's never lost on me the shoulders that I stand on, that we all stand on, right? The people who paved the way for us. Like I mentioned before, obviously James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, and Toni Morrison, but there's there's just the Maya Angelou's, the Octavia Butlers, and so many names that we don't know, right? That we should know. So legacy, I think that being a Black creator always means that I have to add something to that legacy of Black creation, because that's why the doors were open. That's why the path was paved for us to do that, for the next person to be able to do even more.
Yeah.
Wow, how do you follow that? That's a lot. But I agree. I think that being a Black creator means, for me, liberation. I think that Black folks, like Fred was just saying, have always been creators, and some of the best creators. And so in that legacy, in that vein, to have the ability to create and be able to use that as a form of liberation and a form of expression is an honor.
Thank you both.
Thanks for checking out this episode of the Black Creators Series, a Candlewick Press and Red Clay Educators collaboration. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notifications button so you won't miss an episode. For more information about the Black Creators Series, go to blackcreatorseries.candlewick.com or sonjacherrypaul.com, or go to Red Clay Ed on Twitter and Instagram.